Save the enemy in war from enemy to ally behind the shocking decision. The war on the planet Thyros raged like a storm that had swallowed up all light, leaving only a desolate wasteland behind. Kyran, a battle-hardened Earth Special Forces soldier, staggered through the chaos, his rifle in hand, eyes scanning the wreckage of the battlefield. His team had been decimated, and the remaining enemy forces had retreated, leaving nothing but fire and the smell of burned metal in the air. The air felt heavy with the weight of 1,000 forgotten lives. He could feel the crunch of shattered glass beneath his boots, a sound too eerie for comfort. He was alone. His mission was to secure the area and gather intel on the Zarathian forces, but now all he could think of was surviving long enough to find an extraction point. His radio crackled with static, the communication line a faint thread of connection to the chaos unfolding beyond. He tried to reach his squadron, but the signal was dead. Kyran moved cautiously through the ruins, his senses heightened. He knew Thyros like the back of his hand, but the war had changed everything. The planet, once a thriving colony, was now a broken shell, its cities razed, its wildlife destroyed. What little was left of it was claimed by the war between the Galactic Alliance and the Zarathians, a brutal empire whose cruelty had been well documented. Suddenly his foot caught on something soft, nearly hidden under the rubble. He froze, his heartbeat quickening. It wasn't a pile of debris, but a body. Kyran crouched beside the figure, his hand brushing the dust away. A Zarathian military commander lay before him, her silver eyes wide open but lifeless. Her form was adorned in the distinctive armor of the Zarathian elite, her status unmistakable. Kyran knew who she was, Zara, a commander known for her ruthless tactics on the battlefield. But as he knelt next to her, he saw something he hadn't expected. Her face, bruised and bloodied, betrayed nothing of the savage warrior that had been painted in the Alliance's propaganda. He reached for his med pack without thinking. His training had taught him never to show mercy to the enemy, but there was something about the sight of Zara lying there that made him hesitate. His mind screamed at him to leave, to retreat, before the Zarathian forces could arrive and punish him for his decision. Yet in that moment, something more primal pushed him to act. His fingers touched her pulse point, weak but still there. The decision was made. He would help her. He quickly set to work bandaging her wounds and stabilizing her as best he could. She was barely conscious, groaning as he moved her carefully. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the choice he had just made. He wasn't supposed to help the enemy. He wasn't supposed to do anything but eliminate them. But as he lifted Zara into his arms, the rules of war suddenly felt irrelevant. Kyran couldn't explain why he did it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the endless bloodshed, or the bitter knowledge that in war there were no true victors, only survivors. As he moved through the desolate landscape, dodging the occasional explosion and trying to avoid detection, he thought about how easy it would have been to leave Zara behind. But that wasn't the man he was, or at least that wasn't who he wanted to be. The feeling of a person's life in your hands changed you. Kyran carried Zara through the broken ruins of Thyros, moving quickly but cautiously. Every step felt like an eternity. The silence of the dead planet was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the winds that stirred the ashes of what was once a thriving world. The only sounds that mattered to Kyran were the faint rasps of Zara's breathing and his own footsteps. They were being hunted, he knew that much. The Zarathians would stop at nothing to reclaim their fallen commander, and his own people, the Galactic Alliance, wouldn't hesitate to condemn him as a traitor for aiding the enemy. As he trudged through the ruins, a part of Kyran's mind kept drifting back to his comrades who would never understand. They had all been raised with one principle: eliminate the enemy. There was no room for compassion in warfare. Compassion was a weakness, and yet in Zara's bloodied form, he saw no enemy. Just a person who had been left behind just like him. He reached an abandoned military base, its walls half collapsed from years of neglect. It was the safest place he could think of for now, though it was far from ideal. Kyran pushed open the rusted door with a grunt, his muscles aching from the weight of Zara on his shoulders. Inside it was dark, save for the flickering light of a broken emergency beacon in the corner. He found a small room, almost a storage closet, and gently laid Zara down on the cold concrete floor. Her silver eyes fluttered open for a moment, and for the first time since he had found her, she spoke. "Why?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Why help me? Kyran wiped the sweat from his brow, staring at her, unsure of how to answer. I don't know, he muttered, his voice rough. You're not the enemy. Not anymore. Zara, despite her pain, chuckled weakly. You're a fool, she said, her voice dripping with irony. I should be the last person you help. Maybe, Kyran replied, sitting down against the wall, eyes locked on her. But you're still a person. We're all just people, aren't we? Zara stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of the world outside pressing in on them. Kyran's mind raced with questions. Could he trust her? Was this decision going to cost him everything? His allegiance to the Galactic Alliance, his comrades, his life. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All he could focus on was the fragile human connection they had formed in the midst of all the destruction. As the hours passed, Zara slowly regained her strength, though her movements remained stiff and hesitant. The first night they spent together in the base was uneasy. Kyran kept his distance not out of distrust, but because he had no idea how to bridge the chasm that had separated them. Two soldiers, two enemies, now trapped in a dying world. Yet over time, as the days dragged on, he began to see Zara not as a fierce enemy, but as someone who had been just as ensnared by the horrors of war as he had. She told him about her past, about the Zarathians, their empire, and the brutal training they underwent to become elite soldiers. She spoke of how weakness was punished and how loyalty to the empire was the only thing that mattered. She had been taught to hate humans, to see them as inferior and expendable. But now, facing her own mortality and the fragility of the empire, she had sworn to protect Zara, was starting to question everything she had been taught. Kyran in turn shared his own story about his life on Earth before the war, his training in the Galactic Alliance's special forces, and the loss of his friends. He told her about the hard lessons he'd learned in battle, the price of duty, the cost of survival, and how, despite it all, he had always believed in one thing, that he was fighting for the greater good. But in the midst of war, it became harder to tell what that greater good really was. Their conversations were long and at times uncomfortable. There were moments when Kyran felt a deep sense of doubt gnawing at him, especially when Zara's eyes would flicker with uncertainty as she listened to him speak. Was he really fighting for something? Just, was the Alliance really the good guys in all this? But as the days turned into weeks, an unspoken understanding began to form between them. They weren't enemies anymore. They were survivors. And despite their differences, they had one thing in common: the will to live. One night, while lying awake staring at the cracked ceiling of the abandoned base, Kyran heard Zara's voice in the darkness. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely audible. Kyran didn't answer right away. He had no answers. The war, the galaxy, everything seemed so distant now. It felt like they were two people lost in a world that didn't care about them. But then he spoke, his voice steady but uncertain. We survive. Together. Zara was quiet for a long time, and for the first time Kyran thought he heard something in her voice, something that wasn't just doubt or cynicism, but hope. Together, she whispered. The days spent in the abandoned base dragged on, and with each passing moment, the bond between Kyran and Zara deepened. The physical distance between them shrank, but the tension of their past remained like an invisible wall, never fully allowing them to relax. Kyran found himself frequently glancing at her, as though waiting for some sign of hostility or betrayal. Yet each time all he saw was the exhaustion that mirrored his own. Zara, too, kept her guard up, her sharp eyes never fully trusting Kyran's intentions, but gradually she began to relax, if only a little. They had established a routine, one that was equal parts necessity and strange camaraderie. Kyran would forage for supplies, bringing back food and equipment from the ruins. Zara, once a fierce combatant, now used her knowledge to help him repair the base's meager defenses, reinforcing makeshift barriers, and setting traps for any would-be intruders. Despite her alien nature, her methods were efficient, more efficient even than most of Kyran's own training. There was something about her focus, the precision in her movements, that made him respect her more than he ever thought possible. One afternoon, while Kyran was scavenging near the outskirts of the base, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A convoy of Zarathian soldiers, their armor gleaming in the weak sunlight, was making its way toward the base. His heart sank as he realized that they weren't just passing by. They were searching for Zara. Kyran didn't hesitate. He immediately ran back to the base, his mind racing. He had to warn Zara. He had to protect her. By the time he returned, Zara was already preparing for the worst. She had been tracking the movements of the enemy using her sharp instincts and the sparse intel Kyran had gathered. "They've found us," she said quietly, her voice devoid of panic but full of resolve. "We don't have much time." Kyran's mind raced as he quickly began to strategize. The base was in no condition to withstand a full-on assault, but he knew one thing: they couldn't escape through the front door. "We need to leave now," Kyran said, urgency in his tone. "I'll distract them. You head to the secondary exit. Take cover until it's clear." Zara's silver eyes locked with his, and for a brief moment Kyran saw something akin to gratitude and fear in her gaze. It was a mixture he hadn't expected, a sign that she was no longer the merciless commander he had once believed her to be. "I'll cover you," Zara replied, her voice steady. "It's not just your fight anymore." The plan was simple. Kyran would use the remains of an old ground vehicle to create a diversion. He would activate its engines, allowing the smoke and noise to draw the Zarathians' attention, while Zara made her way to the secondary exit. They would both escape, but the chances of survival were slim. Yet in that moment, both of them seemed willing to accept those odds. Kyran moved quickly, his mind alert, his body moving on instinct. He slid into the wrecked vehicle, his hands trembling slightly as he activated the engine. The loud roar of the engine echoed across the desolate landscape, smoke billowing from the exhaust pipes. He could hear the Zarathians approach, the clanking of their boots growing louder as they neared the base. He glanced over at Zara one last time, and she gave him a single nod, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they were both in. Kyran floored the accelerator, pushing the vehicle forward. The smoke enveloped the base, and he could hear the enemy soldiers shouting in confusion as they approached the source of the noise. He had given Zara the time she needed. As he drove the vehicle into the open space, the loud engine noise masked the sound of his footsteps. He watched in the rear-view mirror as Zara slipped out of the base's side exit, vanishing into the dust. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. The distraction worked, but now it was only a matter of time before the Zarathians realized the ruse. He had to keep them busy. The first few shots rang out, lasers streaking toward the vehicle as the Zarathians realized they had been deceived. Kyran gritted his teeth, gripping the steering wheel harder. He swerved the vehicle to avoid the blast, pushing it to its limits. The sound of lasers hitting the ground around him was deafening. He wasn't sure how much longer the vehicle would hold up, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. Zara was out there. She was alive. The vehicle lurched forward, the tires screeching as the engines sputtered. Kyran knew it wouldn't last much longer. But he also knew that if he could just draw the enemy far enough away, he might buy her the time she needed to escape. With a final burst of speed, the vehicle shot forward, its engine sputtering out in a plume of smoke and fire. Kyran was thrown against the steering wheel as the vehicle came to a screeching halt. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the sounds of footsteps filled the air. The Zarathians were close. Kyran's pulse quickened. He had to move. He had to get to Zara. He pushed the door open and sprinted toward the secondary exit, ignoring the sharp pangs of pain in his legs. He had to find her. Kyran sprinted through the crumbled remains of the base, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. His heart thundered in his chest as he rounded a corner, the distant sounds of Zarathian soldiers shouting echoing in his ears. They were close. Too close. He pushed harder, his legs burning from the effort. He couldn't afford to be caught, not now. Not when Zara was depending on him. As he reached the secondary exit, his eyes darted around, scanning the debris for any sign of her. The dust and smoke from the earlier diversion had settled, leaving the area eerily quiet. Kyran's mind raced. She had to be nearby. She had to be alive. A faint rustling caught his attention, and he turned to find Zara crouched behind a pile of metal debris, her silver eyes glinting in the dim light. She was alive. Relief surged through Kyran, but he quickly squashed it, focusing instead on the task at hand. They weren't out of danger yet. "Zara!" he hissed, moving toward her with quick, calculated steps. "We need to keep moving." Zara nodded, her expression grim but determined. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her features. "But we're not going to get far if we don't have a plan." Kyran scanned the horizon, his mind working in overdrive. The Zarathians would be sweeping the area in minutes, and their chances of escape were slim without proper cover. He needed to buy them more time. "We'll head for the canyon to the east," Kyran decided, pointing in the direction he'd memorized from his maps of the planet. "There's a narrow pass we can use to slip past them. It's our best shot." Zara didn't question him. She stood up silently following his lead as they moved quickly and quietly through the debris field. The weight of the situation was not lost on either of them. Every step they took felt like a countdown, an ever-present reminder that death was chasing them, waiting for one mistake, one wrong move. As they approached the edge of the base, Kyran motioned for Zara to halt. He crouched low, peering over the edge of a collapsed structure toward the horizon. The sound of approaching footsteps reached his ears, Zarathian soldiers patrolling in a perfect formation. They were getting closer, and there wasn't enough time to wait for them to pass. "We'll have to take them out," Kyran murmured, his voice low but resolute. Zara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I can handle it," she said, already reaching for the weapons at her side. She was a trained killer, a commander of the Zarathian elite forces, and Kyran knew that she was more than capable of taking care of herself. But still, the thought of her engaging in a direct confrontation made his stomach twist with unease. They had already defied so much by working together. The last thing he wanted was to push her back into the violence of war that had consumed them both. "Let me take the first shot," Kyran said, his voice firm. Zara raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You've never fought a Zarathian." Kyran gave her a crooked smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, today's a good day to start." He moved with precision, stepping into position behind a large piece of debris. His rifle, still in his grip, was steady in his hands. He peeked over the edge, watching as the Zarathian soldiers drew closer. His heartbeat quickened, but his focus remained sharp. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ensuring that they both had a chance to escape. He wasn't going to let the war take her again. The first soldier came into view, a young Zarathian, his helmet reflecting the dying sunlight. Kyran took a deep breath and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and the soldier collapsed, his body crumpling to the ground. The others were momentarily stunned, but within seconds they were taking cover, weapons aimed toward Kyran's position. Zara wasted no time. She leaped into action, her movements fluid and efficient like a predator hunting its prey. With a few swift, silent movements, she took out 2 more soldiers, leaving the rest disoriented and vulnerable. Kyran took the opportunity to move forward, covering Zara as she worked her way through the remaining enemies. Within minutes, the area was clear. The silence that followed was both deafening and comforting. They had survived this round, but Kyran knew that the clock was ticking. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. "Let's move," he said, gesturing toward the canyon. "Now." Zara nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings as she fell into step beside him. They moved with purpose, each step bringing them closer to the canyon's narrow pass. The weight of their decisions, the choices they had made, hung heavily in the air. Kyran couldn't help but wonder if they were making the right choice by running. Would they make it out alive? Was there any hope for peace in a galaxy torn apart by war? The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Kyran felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. Hope. They reached the canyon's edge just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. They paused for a moment, surveying the terrain ahead. "This is it," Zara said, her voice soft but resolute. Kyran looked at her, a silent understanding passing between them. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for something bigger, something that went beyond survival. They were fighting for a chance at a different future, one where war wasn't the only answer. "Let's go," Kyran said, and together they descended into the canyon, leaving behind the shattered remnants of their past lives, stepping into the unknown future that awaited them. The canyon was narrow, its steep walls rising like jagged teeth, casting long shadows across the rocky path. Kyran and Zara moved with careful steps, the sound of their boots echoing against the walls, the weight of their pursuers lingering like a dark cloud. There was no telling how much time they had before the Zarathians found them. Every minute felt like a lifetime. The air here was different, thinner, colder. The planet's atmosphere had been deteriorating for years, a side effect of the war that had ravaged Thyros. The planet's fragile environment seemed to mirror the chaos they had been forced to endure. Kyran couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency, an underlying dread that they were running out of time, out of chances. Zara's pace was steady beside him, though her movements were more guarded now. The fire in her eyes had dimmed a little, replaced by something more cautious, more vulnerable. She wasn't the commanding officer she had once been, at least not in the traditional sense. Now she was a survivor just like him. Kyran glanced over at her, taking in the way her posture had softened. She wasn't walking like a soldier anymore. She was walking like someone who had started to see a different path. The change in her was subtle, but it was there. The ruthless commander was still inside her, but now there was something else, something human, something he had come to recognize in himself as well. "How much further?" Zara asked, her voice breaking the silence. Kyran squinted up at the sky. The sun was low, casting an orange hue across the horizon. They had made good progress, but there was still a long way to go before they reached the next settlement, a place where they might find refuge. "A few more miles," he said, his voice steady. "We'll make it by nightfall." Zara nodded but didn't say anything more. The quiet between them had become comfortable, familiar even. It wasn't that they had stopped being soldiers, it was more that they had stopped being enemies. They were simply two people caught in a war that neither had truly chosen. As they pressed on, Kyran couldn't help but wonder if they were both running from something more than just the Zarathians. Were they running from the war itself, from the values they had been taught, or were they running towards something, toward each other? He stole a glance at Zara. She was looking ahead, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. The quiet tension between them had been building ever since their first conversation, and it felt like the unspoken words were ready to spill out. Kyran wasn't sure if he was ready to face them, yet there was too much at stake. But somehow in that fleeting moment, the thought of opening up to her didn't feel as terrifying as it once had. "We're not going to make it," Zara said suddenly, her voice a low murmur that sent a chill through Kyran's spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, stopping in his tracks to look at her. His heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Zara turned to face him, her eyes filled with something dark, something more vulnerable than he had ever seen. "We're running from the inevitable," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "No matter how far we go, no matter what we do, the war will catch up with us. The Zarathians will never let me go, and the Alliance, they'll never accept what we've done." Kyran's chest tightened. He had known that this wasn't a permanent solution. They were living on borrowed time, and deep down he had always known that. But hearing Zara voice the thought out loud made it feel more real, more crushing. "They'll keep chasing us," she continued. "We're expendable to them, and they won't stop until they have either killed us or turned us into weapons to fight for their cause." Kyran stepped closer, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "Maybe," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but we're not just running anymore. We're choosing something else, something different." Zara met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then something flickered in her eyes, a fleeting spark of something hopeful. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just a refusal to accept defeat. Either way, Kyran felt it, a slight change in the air between them. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore," he said, his voice quiet but determined. "We're fighting for something better, something beyond the war. We're fighting for a future where we can make our own choices, where we don't have to be anyone's weapon. Just us." Zara looked away for a moment, her jaw tightening. Then to Kyran's surprise, she nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right," she murmured, "but it won't be easy. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I can be anything other than what they made me." Kyran gently cupped her face, turning her gaze back toward him. "You can," he said simply. "We can. Together." The words hung in the air between them, lingering in the space where their shared history had once stood. The reality of their situation was still daunting, but something had changed in that brief exchange. For the first time, Zara didn't look like the hardened warrior she had once been. She looked like someone who was trying to understand herself, to understand what it meant to be human, to be free from the chains of war that had bound them both. They continued walking side by side through the canyon, the weight of the world still pressing on their shoulders. But now Kyran felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. They weren't just running from their enemies, they were running towards something new. A future they could shape together. As night fell, the canyon around them grew dark, but the stars above provided a dim light, guiding them on. The path ahead was still uncertain, But one thing was clear: they were no longer enemies. They were allies bound by something stronger than the war that had torn their lives apart. They were bound by hope. The journey through the canyon was more grueling than either of them had anticipated. The narrow passageway twisted and turned, forcing them to climb over rocks and squeeze through tight spaces. The hours stretched on the only sounds of their breathing and the distant rumble of the planet's unstable terrain. Zara and Kyran moved in sync, the bond between them solidifying with every obstacle they overcame. They hadn't spoken much after the conversation that had passed between them. There was a quiet understanding now, an unspoken connection that allowed them to simply exist together without needing to fill the silence. Kyran focused on the path ahead, his thoughts spinning around the choices they had made, the future that was still uncertain. He wasn't a strategist, nor was he a diplomat. But what he did know, what he had learned in the harshest conditions, was that survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about knowing when to trust, when to take a risk, and when to stand firm. And as they trudged through the rocky terrain, he realized that this alliance they had formed might be the greatest act of defiance they could offer against the forces that sought to control them. The war had turned them both into tools, but now they were reclaiming themselves, choosing to fight for a different kind of future. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the canyon began to widen. The steep walls fell away, revealing a vast open plain stretching out before them. The orange glow of the setting sun bathed the landscape in a warm golden light, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the horizon. It was beautiful, quiet, peaceful in a way that felt almost unnatural after everything they had experienced. But they didn't have time to appreciate it. Kyran's sharp eyes scanned the open field, searching for signs of danger. There was no telling when the Zarathian patrols would start sweeping through the area, and they were still far from the settlement where they hoped to find refuge. "We need to keep moving," Kyran said, his voice breaking the silence. "We can't risk staying out in the open like this." Zara nodded silently, and they both began to move again, this time at a quicker pace. But as they stepped into the open, the sound of distant engines suddenly pierced the quiet, sending a wave of panic through Kyran's chest. He froze, motioning for Zara to do the same. "Zarathian patrol," he whispered, his voice tense. "They're coming our way." Zara's eyes darted around her mind, working as quickly as ever. "We can't outrun them," she said flatly. "There's nowhere to hide." Kyran's thoughts raced. The vast expanse of the plain offered little cover, and the approaching engines meant the patrol was likely airborne, ready to spot them from above. They had only one option left: make a stand. "We'll have to fight," Kyran said, his voice firm. Zara didn't argue. She reached for the weapon strapped to her back, her movements smooth and practiced. Despite the situation, there was a calmness in her, an understanding that this was the only way forward. Kyran did the same, pulling out his sidearm and checking the ammunition. The sound of the engines grew louder, signaling that the patrol was closing in. They had little time to prepare. "Stay low," Kyran instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll take them by surprise." Zara gave him a sharp nod, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the terrain. She was no longer the enemy, no longer the fierce Zarathian commander. Now she was an ally. And Kyran knew that in the next few minutes, everything they had fought for, everything they had become, was going to be put to the test. The engines roared closer, and Kyran felt the adrenaline surge in his veins. He could hear the heavy hum of the patrol's craft as it neared. It would be here any second. Kyran dropped to his stomach belly against the cold ground and gestured for Zara to do the same. The grass here was sparse, but it was enough to provide minimal cover. They had to rely on the element of surprise, and they had to make their shots count. The patrol's craft finally came into view, hovering just above the ground, its sleek, metallic body reflecting the sun's dying light. The soldiers aboard it were scanning the area below, their weapons at the ready. They were too focused on the terrain to notice Kyran and Zara lying in wait just a few dozen meters away. Kyran's breath slowed as he aimed his weapon at the first soldier, the crosshairs steady on the target. He squeezed the trigger, sending a shot straight into the patrolman's chest. The soldier fell without a sound, his weapon tumbling from his hands. Zara moved with lightning speed, her blaster in hand. She took out the second soldier before he could even react, the shot precise and deadly. The remaining soldiers scrambled, shocked by the sudden attack, but it was too late. Kyran and Zara were already on the move, firing at the remaining soldiers, picking them off one by one. The last soldier made a desperate attempt to reach his weapon, but he never made it. Kyran's shot rang out just as the soldier ducked behind cover, and the patrol was no more. Kyran and Zara stood in the aftermath, breathing heavily, their bodies taut with the rush of battle. For a moment they simply stood there, silent, staring at the fallen soldiers who had once been their enemies. "That was unexpected," Zara said, her voice low, a hint of surprise in her tone. Kyran nodded, glancing around the battlefield. "We don't have much time. The others will be here soon." Zara's expression hardened. "Then let's make sure they don't find us." Together they turned and made their way toward the distant settlement, their steps quick and purposeful. The sun had set completely now, the sky above them, a canvas of deep blues and purples. The night stretched out before them, full of uncertainty and danger, but also full of promise. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over, and yet for the first time in a long while, Kyran felt that maybe they had a chance. Together they could survive, and maybe, just maybe, they could change the course of everything. As the night pressed on the world around them, seemed to close in the darkness, becoming both a cloak and a shackle. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the rough, uneven terrain of the desolate planet. Kyran's thoughts drifted between the immediate task at hand, getting to the settlement, and the lingering doubts that tugged at the edges of his mind. The battle was far from over. The path ahead remained uncertain, and the Zarathians would not relent. But tonight, for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a victory to cling to. Kyran glanced over at Zara, who was still moving silently beside him. She was as focused as ever, but there was something else in her movements, now something softer. She wasn't the cold, calculating commander he had met on the battlefield anymore. He had seen glimpses of that ruthless warrior, but now in the stillness of the night, he saw someone who was more than just a soldier. He saw a person, someone who had been shaped by forces beyond her control, yet who was beginning to shape her own path. They had been through hell together, and yet here they were still standing, still fighting. Zara had no reason to trust him. He was a human, an enemy in her eyes not long ago, and yet here they were side by side, working together toward a future they had no guarantee of reaching. Kyran thought about the choice he had made, the choice to save her when every part of his training screamed at him to let her die. It hadn't been a choice that came easily, but now as they walked toward the settlement, the weight of that decision felt lighter. He couldn't deny the bond that had formed between them, nor could he deny the quiet hope that had begun to take root in his heart. They reached the outskirts of the settlement just before dawn, the sky above them lightening to pale shades of pink and orange. The settlement appeared as a quiet oasis in the midst of the chaos, nestled between craggy hills, its buildings humble but functional. There were no signs of life yet, but Kyran knew they couldn't risk waiting around. The Zarathians would surely send reinforcements by morning, and their time was running out. "We need to get inside," Kyran said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Find shelter, blend in." Zara nodded, her eyes scanning the area, ever vigilant. She had become a part of the landscape, a shadow within the shadows, something Kyran had come to admire. Her survival instincts were unmatched, her ability to read a situation as sharp as any blade. They had both become something different in this war, survivors, fighters, and ultimately allies in a fight that had long since lost its meaning. They made their way into the settlement, cautiously taking care to avoid detection. The streets were still empty, the houses dark, as though the whole town was still asleep. But Kyran knew better. This place, though seemingly quiet, was a front like all settlements on war-torn planets. It would be filled with people who had learned to live in the shadows, people who had adapted to survive in a universe where war was the only constant. As they crept through the narrow streets, they came across a small market square. A few stalls stood idle, their goods covered by tarps, the vendors nowhere to be seen. It was eerily quiet, but Kyran felt a sense of hope rising within him. If they could find a safe place here, if they could blend in with these people, maybe they could have a chance to plan their next move. Zara stopped suddenly, her hand on his arm, her eyes narrowing. "Someone's coming," she said softly, her voice tense. Kyran's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the alley ahead, where a faint sound of footsteps echoed. It wasn't a patrol, at least not yet, but it was someone. He motioned for Zara to take cover behind one of the stalls, and they both ducked out of sight, holding their breath. A figure emerged from the alley, a local wearing the simple, ragged clothes of someone who had been living in this place long enough to know the dangers that lurked outside the walls. The figure glanced around nervously, checking the street before pulling something from their coat and old radio. Kyran's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. Zara stepped forward quietly, her movements swift and fluid. She didn't want to start a fight. Neither of them did. But they needed answers, and they needed them now. The figure didn't seem to notice them until Zara was just a few feet away. When he looked up, his eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, Zara was in front of him, her hand on his shoulder. "Relax," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to hurt you. We just need some information." The local swallowed, his hand tightening around the radio. "Who are you? What do you want?" Kyran stepped forward slowly, his hand raised in a gesture of peace. "We're looking for a way out. We're not with the Zarathians or the Alliance. We're just trying to survive." The local eyed them both warily, his gaze flicking between them. It was clear that trust was not easy to come by in this world, where allegiances shifted as easily as the wind. Still, something in their demeanor, their exhaustion, their sincerity seemed to resonate with him. "Survivors, huh?" the local muttered almost to himself. "There's a lot of you out here, you know. But you're not safe. Not in this place. The Zarathians will be back soon, and the Alliance, they don't care about people like us." Kyran frowned. "What do you mean, people like us?" The local hesitated before speaking again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "People who have nothing left to lose. People who are just trying to survive in a world that doesn't care. If you want to stay alive, you need to know who to trust. And right now, I'm not sure if you're that person." Zara's hand tightened around her blaster, but she held her ground. "We don't want trouble. We just need a place to stay. Can you help us?" The local studied them both carefully, weighing his options. After a long pause, he sighed. "All right, follow me." He led them down the quiet streets of the settlement, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they walked, Kyran couldn't help but feel the weight of everything they had been through, the pain, the loss, the uncertainty, and yet for the first time he felt something different. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just survival. But whatever it was enough to keep moving forward. The local led them deeper into the settlement, weaving through narrow, dimly lit alleys and quiet back streets. There was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Kyran couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though there were no eyes that followed them, at least not that he could see. The people here were skilled at hiding, and Kyran suspected that many had learned to stay hidden out of necessity. In this war-torn corner of the galaxy, there was no room for the weak. They arrived at a small, inconspicuous building near the end of a long alley. The structure was old, its walls cracked and weathered by years of neglect, but it was sturdy enough to offer shelter from the elements and, more importantly, from anyone who might come looking for them. The locals pushed open the door with a creak, and a wave of stale air greeted them as they stepped inside. The interior was sparse, furnished only with a few mismatched chairs and a small table. There were no windows, just dim light from a flickering bulb overhead. The place smelled faintly of old food and dust, but it was a refuge, a place to regroup and plan. Kyran felt a strange mix of relief and unease. They were safe for the moment, but only for the moment. The local closed the door behind them and locked it with a loud click. He turned to face them, his eyes lingering on Zara for a moment before shifting to Kyran. "You're not the first ones to come through here," he said, his voice low. "A lot of people have tried to hide from the war, but you need to understand something. Staying here isn't the answer. The Zarathians are relentless, and the Alliance, they'll be looking for you soon enough. You don't belong here. No one does." Kyran and Zara exchanged a brief look. They weren't here to stay permanently, but they needed time to plan. They needed information, allies, anything that could help them fight back, anything that could give them a future beyond the war that had defined their lives for so long. "We just need a little time," Kyran said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "We don't want to cause trouble. We just need to figure out what comes next." The local studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if sizing up Kyran's sincerity. Then with a slow nod, he turned away and walked toward a corner of the room where a small stash of supplies lay. "Time's a luxury in this world," he muttered as he began sorting through crates. "But I'll give you what I can. You're going to need food, water, and something to protect yourselves. Can't trust anyone around here, and with the war on, everyone's desperate." Zara stood a little straighter as she watched the local, her hands subconsciously brushing the weapon holstered at her side. Kyran noticed the tension in her stance, but he didn't speak. They were both on edge, trying to figure out their next move in this strange, hostile place. The local returned with a small crate filled with food rations and a few canisters of water. He handed them over with little ceremony. "This should hold you for a while, but if you're planning on staying here long term, you'll need more than that. And the first thing you need to know is trust is a currency that doesn't come cheap here. People will take advantage of you, and you'll be lucky if they don't sell you out to the highest bidder." Kyran took the crate from the local, nodding in understanding. "We're not staying long," he said again, more to reassure himself than the locals. "We just need to keep our heads down and figure out our next step." The local's lips curled into something between a sneer and a tired smile. "I've heard that before," he muttered, then turned toward a small cot in the corner. "Sleep if you can. You'll need it." Kyran and Zara moved toward the far side of the room, settling into a makeshift corner. As they sat, the weight of the day seemed to press in on them. The rush of adrenaline that had kept them alive through the battle with the Zarathians and the trek through the canyon was fading, leaving a heavy exhaustion in its wake. Kyran could feel the fatigue in his limbs, the tightness in his chest that only came after days, weeks of relentless tension. Zara sat beside him, her back against the cold wall, her eyes scanning the room as if she couldn't quite relax. Kyran understood. Neither of them could truly relax. Not yet. The war had taken too much from them, and as much as they might want to let their guard down, they both knew the danger wasn't over. It never would be. "I still don't understand," Zara said after a long silence, her voice low. "Why did you help me after everything? Why didn't you just leave me to die?" Kyran turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "Because I couldn't. I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to become someone who can just ignore another human being in need." Zara's gaze softened, though only slightly. "You humans are strange," she muttered almost to herself. "You fight for things that don't make sense, for things that can't be won." Kyran's lips curled into a tired smile. "Maybe, but that's what keeps us alive. It's what keeps us human." Zara was silent for a long time, her eyes distant as she stared into the corner of the room. Kyran could see the conflict within her, the battle raging between the warrior she had been and the person she was starting to become. The war had shaped her into someone unrecognizable, someone capable of unspeakable things. But he could see the cracks in her armor, and despite everything, despite her past, he believed there was more to her than the cold exterior she presented. "Let's just get through tonight," Kyran said quietly, breaking the silence. "Tomorrow we figure out our next move." Zara nodded, her face hardening as she glanced at the door. "Tomorrow," she repeated. As the two of them settled into the silence of the room, the weight of their shared past hung between them. But Kyran felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. A way to move beyond the war, beyond the violence, and start rebuilding something new. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to close his eyes to rest. They still had a long way to go, but at least for tonight they were safe, and maybe that was enough. Morning came too soon. The faint light creeping through the cracks in the walls of the small shelter offered little warmth or comfort. Kyran woke to the sound of faint rustling. Zara was already up, her eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. The same tension that had plagued them since the moment they met was still present, but now it was tempered by something else, something deeper. Kyran stretched his arms above his head, his muscles aching from the long trek the day before. He hadn't realized how much he had been pushing himself until now. The weariness of the last few weeks settled in his bones. He rubbed his eyes and glanced over at Zara, who was already preparing herself for the day. She was methodical, her movements deliberate, as though every action had a purpose. "Sleep well?" Kyran asked, trying to break the silence that had stretched between them for the last few hours. Zara didn't immediately respond. She pulled a small pack of supplies from her side, checking its contents. "I'm used to the quiet," she said, her voice cool. "But you're not used to stillness, are you?" Kyran gave a half smile, knowing exactly what she meant. He wasn't used to not being on the move, to not having a clear plan or objective. His life had been one mission after another, one fight after another. But now they were stuck in this moment with no clear enemy to face, no orders to follow. The war felt distant, almost like a memory. "Guess I'll get used to it," he said, pushing himself off the floor. He grabbed the small crate of supplies the local had provided them, sorting through it briefly. There wasn't much, just enough to keep them alive for another day or two. They needed to move quickly, find their next step. But where would they go? Kyran turned to Zara. "We can't stay here for long. We're a liability to the people in this settlement. If the Zarathians or the Alliance," Zara cut in, her voice tight, "both sides want us. We're not just a liability, we're a target." He nodded, agreeing with her. The more they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. And the longer they stayed hidden, the more they risked becoming something they didn't want to be: hunted animals with no home, no purpose. "We need to get out of here," Kyran said, more to himself than to Zara. "We need to find something that will give us a chance to fight back." Zara gave him a sharp look, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Fight back against what?" "The war." Kyran paused, feeling the weight of her question. She was right. The war had never been about what they wanted. It had been thrust upon them, a cycle of violence and destruction they couldn't control. But there had to be a way to change that. There had to be a way to stop the endless conflict. "Against the people who want to keep it going," Kyran said, his voice steady. "We have to find a way to stop the war, not just for us, but for everyone." Zara didn't speak right away. Her eyes drifted to the small crate of supplies in Kyran's hands, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and turned her gaze back to him. "How do you plan on doing that? You're just one soldier. I'm just one commander. The war's bigger than us, Kyran. It's always been bigger." He looked at her, his mind turning over the same question. How could they do it? How could two people, two outcasts, make any difference in a galaxy where wars were waged over resources, power, and control? "I don't know," Kyran admitted, "but I know one thing. We're not the only ones who want it to stop." Zara glanced away for a moment, her face softening slightly. For the first time in a long while, Kyran could see a flicker of something in her eyes, something beyond the soldier she had been trained to be. It was hope, and maybe it was the same hope that had driven him to help her to take that first step away from everything they had been taught. "All right," she said finally, her voice softer now. "So what's the plan?" Kyran paused, looking out the small window of the shelter, his mind racing through the possibilities. They needed allies. They needed information. They needed a way to communicate with the people who could actually make a difference. The Galactic Alliance, the Zarathians, both sides were entrenched in their own beliefs, unwilling to listen to anything that might disrupt the status quo. But there had to be a way to make them listen. There had to be a way to turn the tide. "I have an idea," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We go to the nearest communications hub. We can send out a signal to the right people. There are factions, people who want peace, who want an end to the fighting. We just have to find them. Convince them we're worth trusting." Zara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You think they'll listen to us after everything we've done, after everything we've been through?" Kyran nodded. "We don't have much time to convince them, but I think they will. We'll have to make them see that we're more than just pawns in this war. We're people who want something better, something beyond destruction." Zara stared at him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "All right, let's do it. But you'd better be right. Because if you're not—" "I'm right," Kyran interrupted, meeting her gaze firmly. "We'll make them listen." They both stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of their decision hanging in the air. There was no turning back now. They were about to take a gamble, and whether it paid off or not, they had no choice but to try. With a deep breath, Kyran picked up the crate of supplies and headed toward the door. "Let's get moving," he said, his voice steady. "We've got a lot to do." Zara followed him without hesitation, her eyes scanning the street outside as they stepped into the fading light of the morning. The settlement around them was quiet, but Kyran knew that would change soon enough. They had no more time to waste. Together they walked toward their uncertain future, knowing that whatever lay ahead, they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something bigger. And that, for the first time, felt like a cause worth risking everything for. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting the world in pale golds and purples, when Kyran and Zara made their way to the communications hub. The path was winding and narrow, leading them out of the relative safety of the settlement and into the open fields beyond. Kyran kept his eyes on the ground ahead, his heart beating steadily in his chest. There was a growing sense of urgency in his mind. The idea of reaching out to those who might be sympathetic to their cause, those who shared their desire for peace, was their last hope. If they failed, they would have nowhere left to go, no one else to turn to. They would remain hunted outcasts in a galaxy that had long since forgotten mercy. Zara walked beside him, her movements silent and measured. She had grown more introspective since the night before, her sharp eyes often scanning their surroundings, always alert. Though Kyran could tell that the walls she had built over the years were beginning to crack, he also knew that trust was still something they both had to earn. They were allies for now, but the war had a way of twisting even the most well-meaning individuals. No matter how far they had come, there was still a part of her that believed survival meant being ready to betray everyone, even the people who had saved her life. They reached the communications hub after an hour of cautious walking. It was an old facility, long since abandoned by the larger powers, but still functional in a limited capacity. The exterior was battered with rust covering the once pristine metal walls, and its doors had been forced open, no longer secured. But the place still hummed with energy, a faint signal still emanating from within, waiting for someone to make use of it. Kyran stepped inside the musty air of the building, heavy with the smell of forgotten technology. He didn't know if the signal would be strong enough to reach the factions he was hoping for, but it was their only shot. Zara followed him, her hand resting on the blaster at her side. "This place feels like it's been dead for years," she muttered, her voice low, almost as though she were talking to herself. "How do you expect us to reach anyone with this broken-down piece of junk?" Kyran shot her a wry grin. "It's the best we've got. Besides, it's not the equipment that's broken. It's the system. We're just trying to find a crack in it." Zara didn't respond. She stood near the entrance, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. She might be quieter these days, but Kyran knew she was always thinking, always weighing their next move. Even in moments of silence, her mind was always on the lookout for danger. Kyran sat down at the old console, his fingers brushing across the worn surface. It was an archaic system, likely obsolete by modern standards, but he had worked with technology like this before. He could make it work. At least he hoped he could. The small screen flickered to life, its blue light casting a soft glow in the dim room. For a few moments, there was only the hum of machinery, the click and buzz of the system trying to connect to any available network. Kyran's fingers danced across the keys, inputting the necessary commands. It wasn't easy, and the connection was sluggish at best, but after several attempts, a message appeared on the screen. The transmission wasn't strong, but it was clear enough. The message he had been waiting for: was there a link to a secure network? The transmission was from a group called the Coalition, a group of resistance fighters and diplomats who had been operating in the shadows, trying to bring peace to the galaxy in the midst of the never-ending war. They were the ones Kyran had hoped would hear them out, the ones who might understand the importance of what they were trying to do. Kyran swallowed his throat dry. "This is it," he muttered, looking up at Zara. "We've got a chance." Zara stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning the screen. "What now?" "Now we send the message." Kyran said, his voice steady, though there was a tremor of excitement in his chest. "We tell them who we are, what we've seen. We show them that the war is no longer just about control and power. It's about survival, and if we don't stop it now, it will never end." Zara's gaze softened just slightly, and for a brief moment, Kyran saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before: hope. It was fleeting, like a candle flickering in the dark, but it was there. Kyran tapped the final key, sending the transmission out into the void. There was nothing more they could do now but wait. The silence in the room stretched on as they both stood there, staring at the screen, waiting for a response. Minutes passed. Then, after what felt like hours, the screen flickered once more. A response. A single line of text appeared, followed by a voice, rough, distorted, but clear enough to understand. "We're listening." Kyran's heart skipped a beat. He could hardly believe it. They were getting through. They were being heard. "Now what?" Zara asked, her voice a little quieter than before. "Now we wait," Kyran replied, "and hope they're willing to listen long enough to make a real difference." The message had been sent, but the true battle had just begun. They weren't out of danger yet. There were still enemies to face, battles to fight, and decisions to make. But for the first time, Kyran felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. The future was still uncertain, still dangerous. But the next step, the one they had taken together, was the most important one they could have made. They had given the galaxy a chance to hear them, a chance to change things. And for the first time, Kyran allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could actually make a difference. They were no longer just survivors. They were something more, a beacon of hope in a galaxy that had long since forgotten how to hope. The silence in the room was deafening, stretched thin by the weight of their anticipation. Kyran stared at the screen, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts, all tumbling over one another in a chaotic blur. The message had been sent, the connection made. But what now? What would the coalition say? Would they be receptive to their plea, or would they be another closed door, another rejection in a galaxy that seemed to have no room left for hope? Zara stood nearby, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She wasn't as outwardly nervous as Kyran, but he could tell by the tension in her stance that she was just as apprehensive. The war had hardened her, turned her into a soldier who had seen the worst humanity and the Zarathians had to offer. But in the weeks since they had begun this uncertain alliance, Kyran had seen cracks in her armor, seen the person underneath the hardened exterior. And though she would never admit it, he could sense the quiet hope she now held, the same fragile hope that flickered in his chest. "I don't like waiting," Zara muttered, breaking the silence. "Not like this." "I know," Kyran replied, his voice a little rough. He could feel the familiar tension creeping into his body, but he fought to suppress it. They had done everything they could. The rest was out of their hands. "But we have to. There's nothing we can do but wait for them to respond." The seconds felt like minutes, and the minutes felt like hours. Each passing moment stretched the silence thicker, suffocating them both in the unknown. Finally, just as Kyran's patience was wearing thin, the screen flickered again. A new message appeared, the words almost too blurred to read at first. "This is Commander Rhea of the Coalition." The message began, her voice crackling through the speakers, faint but clear enough to hear. "We've received your transmission. I understand your situation, and I'm aware of who you are. Meet us at the rendezvous coordinates. We'll discuss your request in person." Kyran's heart leapt in his chest. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a dismissal. They were being given a chance to be heard. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, glancing over at Zara. Her face, though still stoic, seemed to soften just a fraction. The slightest of smiles tugged at her lips, the first real one he had seen since they had met. And for a brief moment it felt like they had actually made it, like they had a real chance at something different. "Where do we meet?" Zara asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. Kyran's fingers flew across the console, entering the coordinates sent by the Coalition. The screen blinked, displaying a map of the galaxy, and a set of coordinates appeared in the farthest reaches of space, a remote planet far from the eyes of both the Zarathians and the Alliance. It was an isolated location, which made sense. It was a place where they could talk without fear of immediate interception or violence. "An old mining colony," Kyran muttered, his mind processing the details. "It's a safe house. If they trust us, that's where we'll meet." Zara moved closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the map. "It's a long journey. We'll have to move fast. We can't afford to be found before we get there." "I know," Kyran said, "but this is it. This is our shot. If we make it to that rendezvous, if they believe we're serious, they'll help us." Zara finished, her voice more confident now. "But if we don't get there, we'll just be another forgotten casualty of the war." Kyran met her gaze, nodding. She was right. This was their chance, their only shot at making a difference. They couldn't afford to fail. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. They gathered their supplies, double-checked their weapons, and made sure the communications hub was secure. The local had given them just enough provisions to get to the rendezvous point, but Kyran knew they would need to rely on their wits, their speed, and their ability to stay off the radar if they were going to succeed. As they prepared to leave the communications hub, Kyran felt a familiar tension settle in his chest. They were on the move again, no longer standing still in one place, waiting for things to happen. They were taking control of their fate, fighting not just for survival, but for the chance to rewrite the rules of a galaxy that had forgotten how to be kind. "We'll need to move quickly," Zara said, her tone all business now. "The Coalition won't trust us right away. We'll have to prove ourselves to them." "Kree." Kyran nodded, securing his pack. "We'll make them believe. We've got nothing left to lose. They left the communications hub and stepped into the early morning light. The settlement behind them was quiet, peaceful, but it felt like a memory, now a place they couldn't afford to linger in for too long. They had a purpose now, and it was leading them away from the remnants of the old war and towards something more uncertain. As they made their way toward the shuttle that would take them to the remote mining colony, Kyran looked over at Zara, his partner, his ally. She had come a long way since he had first found her lying on the battlefield, and so had he. They had both changed. And though the road ahead was still unclear, there was something in their shared determination that gave Kyran the hope he had almost forgotten. They weren't just running anymore. They weren't just surviving. They were fighting for something bigger, a future, a chance at peace, something that had seemed impossible just days ago. The shuttle's engines roared to life, and with a final glance at the planet they had left behind, they took off, heading toward the unknown. And for the first time, Kyran allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make it. They could change the course of everything. The shuttle hummed steadily beneath their feet, the low vibration of the engines, a constant reminder that they were leaving the remnants of one life behind for the uncertainty of another. Kyran sat in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, his mind focused on the coordinates flashing on the display. Zara was seated beside him, her eyes fixed on the view screen, but her mind seemed a world away. The planet Thyros was already becoming a speck of light in the distance, swallowed up by the vastness of space. A cold, empty reminder of the destruction they'd fled from, and the place where everything had started. The silence between them felt different now, though. It wasn't the kind of silence that weighed heavily on their shoulders, like the kind they had shared in the cave-like shelter. It was a quiet that held possibility, anticipation, and the faintest trace of hope. Kyran had always believed in fighting for a better future, even when he'd lost everything. But now with Zara by his side, that hope felt more tangible than it had in years. Zara shifted in her seat, drawing his attention back to her. "What makes you think they'll trust us after everything we've done?" Kyran glanced at her, his brow furrowing. The question was more rhetorical than anything, but it was a question that had been gnawing at him as well. "Because we're not the enemy anymore," he said slowly, his voice quiet. "We're something different now. We've shown them we're willing to fight for peace, to fight for the future, not just for power or survival." Zara didn't reply right away. Her fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, her eyes distant. She had always been a soldier, trained for battle, trained to believe in victory and domination. But Kyran could see the change in her, the way she was beginning to see the war not as a means to an end, but as an endless cycle that needed to be broken. "You really think they'll listen?" she asked, finally turning her gaze to meet his. "I think they'll listen because we have to make them." Kyran replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We don't have any other choice. If we don't try, then we're no better than the people who started this war in the first place." Zara's lips twitched at the corners, the faintest hint of something resembling a smile. "You really believe that, don't you?" Kyran met her gaze, his expression serious. "I do." The shuttle cut through the darkness of space, a small, fragile vessel carrying two people who had once been enemies, now working toward a common cause. They were a long way from the familiar, a long way from the battlefield where they had each played their part. The war was still out there, looming, waiting for its next battle. But for now, Kyran allowed himself to believe in something beyond the violence. He believed in their chance to make a difference. The journey wasn't long, but it felt endless. Every minute spent in the silence of the shuttle made the reality of their mission weigh heavier on Kyran's mind. But eventually the stars in front of them began to shift the coordinates, slowly aligning with the location of the mining colony. As the planet came into view, Kyran felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They were getting close. "We're here," he said quietly, adjusting the controls. His fingers were steady, but his heart pounded. They were entering a new phase of their journey. The coalition had agreed to meet them, but agreeing to meet wasn't the same as agreeing to trust. It wasn't the same as believing in what they were trying to do. Zara didn't speak, but Kyran could feel the tension in the air between them. The time for words was over. Now it was time to prove themselves. The shuttle descended into the mining colony, a small planet that had long been abandoned by the larger galactic powers. What was once a thriving source of resources now stood as a crumbling testament to the effects of war. The few buildings that remained were battered by time, worn and patched together like the remnants of the world they had once belonged to. It was an ideal meeting place for the coalition, hidden, isolated, and far enough from the larger powers to keep them off the radar. Kyran touched down with a quiet hum, the shuttle settling gently onto the dusty surface. He powered down the engines and turned to Zara, who was already fastening her blaster to her side, her expression unreadable. "This is it," Kyran said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We make it count." Zara nodded, her sharp gaze scanning their surroundings. She had been a soldier her whole life, but now she was something else, something more. "I don't think we have a choice," she said, her voice firm. Together they stood and made their way toward the shuttle's hatch, stepping out into the desolate landscape. The cold air of the planet hit them immediately, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the shuttle. The sounds of their boots crunching on the dust were the only noises in the silence that enveloped them. In the distance they saw a figure waiting for them. A tall, broad-shouldered individual dressed in the rugged garb of a resistance fighter. His face was obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking the unmistakable air of authority in his stance. He was waiting for them. Kyran and Zara approached slowly, their footsteps deliberate. As they came closer, the figure raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "Are you Kyran, Zara?" the man asked, his voice steady but guarded. Kyran nodded. "We are." The man studied them for a long moment, his eyes narrowing behind the shadow of his hood. Finally, he spoke again. "I'm Commander Ria's second-in-command. She's waiting for you inside. Follow me." Without another word, the man turned and began walking toward the entrance of the colony. Kyran and Zara followed closely behind, the weight of their journey pressing heavily on their shoulders. They had made it this far. They had sent their message, and now it was time to see if anyone was willing to listen. The inside of the colony was cold and dimly lit, with only a few sparse lamps casting pools of pale yellow light across the stone floors. It was clear that this place hadn't seen any visitors in years, maybe decades. The walls were lined with metal pipes and rusted machinery, the remnants of a mining operation that had long since been abandoned. Yet despite the desolation, there was something almost comforting about the place. It was a reminder of the past, of a time before the war had ravaged everything. Kyran and Zara followed their guide through the narrow corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old metal. It felt like they were walking through a forgotten tomb, but it was also a tomb that held the promise of something more. This meeting, this moment, could be the turning point they had been waiting for. As they approached a large room at the center of the complex, their guide stopped and turned toward them. "Commander Ria is inside. She'll be the one to decide what happens next." Kyran gave a small nod, and without another word, the guide opened the door, revealing a spacious, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with more machinery, but there were also makeshift tables and chairs scattered about, evidence of the Resistance's presence in the area. At the far end of the room stood a tall woman, her back to them, staring out of a small, cracked window that overlooked the barren landscape outside. Kyran and Zara stepped inside, and the woman turned to face them. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the power in her eyes. She had the kind of presence that demanded attention, and Kyran could feel the weight of it even as he stepped into the room. "You're Kyran and Zara," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been expecting you." Kyran didn't respond immediately, studying her carefully. She looked every bit the part of a seasoned leader, with a sharp gaze and an air of quiet authority. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her clothes were practical, worn, but well kept. She looked like someone who had been fighting for a long time, and someone who wasn't about to back down now. "We've come because we need help," Kyran said, his voice steady, though there was an edge of urgency to it. "The war's been going on for too long. We can't keep fighting like this. We need a way to end it." The woman didn't flinch, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took a step closer to them. "And why should we help you? You're just two soldiers caught between two warring factions. What makes you think you have anything to offer?" Zara stepped forward, her voice cool and controlled. "Because we've seen the cost of this war firsthand. We know what it does to people, to planets, to entire civilizations. We've been used as pawns in this game for too long. It's time for a new way." Commander Ria studied them both for a long moment, her gaze flicking between them. "You're not the first to come here with grand ideas about ending the war. There's no shortage of people who claim they want peace. The problem is peace doesn't come without sacrifice. It doesn't come without understanding what you're up against and understanding what you're willing to lose. Kyran nodded, his voice firm. We know what we're up against, and we're willing to do whatever it takes. Rhea gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. I don't doubt that you are. But the question is, what are you willing to lose? The room fell silent. Kyran and Zara both knew that the stakes were higher than they could fully grasp. This wasn't just about ending a war, it was about changing the very system that had kept it going for so long. It was about shifting the power, reshaping the galaxy into something that didn't revolve around violence and control. I think you both understand, Rhea continued, breaking the silence. The war is a machine, and if you want to stop it, you have to take it apart piece by piece. There's no quick fix, no simple solution. But if you're willing to commit to the cause, to the long and difficult path ahead, I can help you. Zara's eyes flickered with something close to relief, but she quickly masked it with her usual impassiveness. What's the first step? She asked, her tone steady but demanding. Rhea's expression hardened, her gaze sharpening. The first step is to understand the players in this war, the ones pulling the strings. The Zarathians, the Alliance, and the factions that operate in the shadows. You think you can just send a message and hope they'll listen? It's more complicated than that. We need to make sure you're ready, and that means knowing who your real enemies are. Kyran looked at Zara, then back to Rhea. We're ready, he said. We've been fighting this war our entire lives. We know what it costs, but we're done being pawns. We're here because we believe it's time for something different. Rhea nodded, her gaze softening slightly. I believe you. But you have to understand the war won't end because you wish it. It will end because you choose to make it end. And that means understanding what needs to be done to dismantle this system. It won't be easy, and you won't get a happy ending, at least not in the way you're imagining. The air between them thickened with the weight of her words. Kyran felt the tension in his chest tighten, but he also felt something else, a spark of resolve. They had come this far, and they couldn't turn back now. This was their chance to make a real difference. This was their moment to do something bigger than survive something that could truly change the course of the galaxy. Then let's do it, Kyran said, his voice unwavering. We're ready to fight, to do whatever it takes. Rhea studied him carefully, then turned toward the large table in the center of the room. Good. Then we have much to discuss, and much to prepare for. As they moved toward the table, Kyran and Zara shared a brief glance. The road ahead would be long, filled with more challenges and sacrifices than they could predict. But for the first time, Kyran felt that they were on the right path. The path towards something bigger. Something that could change everything. The war wasn't over. But maybe it could be stopped. They just had to be ready to take that first step. The discussion around the table was intense. Each word that passed between Commander Rhea and her subordinates carried weight, each decision adding another layer of complexity to the plan they were beginning to shape. Kyran and Zara sat across from Rhea, listening intently as she outlined the magnitude of what lay ahead. They had made their choice, but it was clear now that the path they had chosen was fraught with peril. We're not dealing with just the Zarathians and the Alliance, Rhea said, her voice steady but commanding. There are also factions within both sides, rogue elements, mercenary groups, shadow organizations that will do anything to maintain the status quo. You think peace is just about negotiation. It's about dismantling entire structures of power that have been in place for centuries. We need to be strategic, patient. Zara shifted in her seat, her eyes locked on the map spread across the table. There were coordinates, targets, and lines connecting them all, a network of operations, safe houses, and key players who were crucial to the mission ahead. It was a roadmap of war, but also a map to something more, a future where the endless cycle of conflict could be broken. Kyran could feel the tension in the room. Rhea wasn't sugarcoating anything. There was no false hope here. It wasn't just about sending messages and hoping someone would listen. It was about turning the tide in a galaxy where peace had been a distant dream, and those who wanted it were often crushed beneath the weight of greed, power, and survival. We'll need to gather intel on every faction involved, Rhea continued. The first step is to secure allies, real allies, the ones who want to see an end to the fighting, not just shift the balance of power in their favor. We've made a list of key figures to contact, but it won't be easy. They'll be watching us? Kyran absorbed her words, his mind turning over the details. The idea of contacting these figures, these potential allies, was daunting, but it was the only way forward. There could be no more hesitation. There was no going back to the way things were. "What's the next move?" Kyran asked, his voice steady. "What do we need to do first?" Rhea turned her gaze toward him, her eyes assessing. "You'll need to infiltrate one of the key factions, an alliance mercenary group operating in the Outer Rim. They've been picking off low-level targets, including resistance members. They're the kind of group that thrives in chaos, and if we can take them out of the equation, it will give us the breathing room we need to rally the others." Zara raised an eyebrow. "A mercenary group? How are we supposed to infiltrate that?" Rhea smiled a small, almost predatory grin that Kyran hadn't seen before. "You two are the perfect candidates for this. Kyran, your military background gives you an edge. Zara, your expertise with the Zarathians makes you invaluable. They'll never see you coming. We'll provide you with everything you need, identities, equipment, everything. But once you're in, you'll need to earn their trust. You can't just waltz in and expect them to fall in line." Kyran and Zara exchanged a look. It was a risky plan, but they didn't have the luxury of time or safety. They needed to act now. "Understood," Kyran said, his voice firm. "When do we leave?" Rhea stood walking over to a small console and tapping a few keys. "You'll leave as soon as you're ready. There's no time to waste." She turned back to face them, her expression serious. "This is just the beginning. But if we can pull this off, if we can take down this mercenary group and expose the corruption that's been holding this war together, it'll send a message. A message that we're not just fighting to survive. We're fighting for something better." Zara stood and grabbed her pack, her gaze shifting from the map to Rhea. "We'll get it done," she said, her voice cold but resolute. "Just tell us where to start." Rhea gave a sharp nod, her eyes reflecting the same determination. "We'll be in touch once you're on the inside. Good luck, both of you." As Kyran and Zara walked out of the room, the weight of what they had agreed to pressed down on them once again. They were no longer just pawns in a war between two empires. They had a purpose now. They were part of something bigger. But that purpose came at a cost. The road ahead would be dangerous, there were no guarantees. They would need to rely on each other more than ever. Zara was quiet as they made their way to the shuttle. Kyran could feel her tension, her uncertainty. It wasn't just the mission that weighed on her. It was the fear that this was all leading to a place she didn't want to go. But Kyran understood that fear. It was the same fear that had kept him up at night, the fear that they were walking into the unknown with no clear way out. "Are you ready for this?" Kyran asked, glancing over at her as they boarded the shuttle. Zara paused, her hand resting on the doorframe as she looked out at the horizon. For a moment, Kyran saw a flash of something in her eyes, a vulnerability that she rarely showed. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the hard resolve he had come to know. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "We're doing this. No turning back." The shuttle engines roared to life, and they took off, heading into the vast unknown. The mission was simple: infiltrate, take down the mercenary group, and send a message. But the stakes were higher than either of them had realized. This wasn't just about ending the war. This was about rewriting the rules of the galaxy itself. The journey ahead would be long, filled with twists and turns they couldn't yet see. But as they soared through the cold expanse of space, Kyran couldn't help but feel that they were on the verge of something much bigger than the war. They were about to take the first step toward a future where peace wasn't just a dream, it was a choice. And for the first time in a long time, Kyran allowed himself to believe in that future.